One of you who are joining us here today. We're going to take a minute just to allow everyone to get into the room. And in the meantime, I will let you know now, and again, after everyone has joined, that there's a Q&A option on the bottom of the screen, and that's the way that you will be able to communicate with us. So if you look for that on the bottom, it could be on the toolbar. It could also be under the section called More with 3 dots. So welcome, and we'll be starting in just a few minutes when everyone has been able to get into the room. So again, welcome to today's seminar on empowering survivors. And to do that, we want to talk about the kind of 3 ways that survivors can be empowered. And so I have 2 wonderful guests whose work I admire very much with me today. First, I'll introduce myself, though. My name is Carol Murchison. I'm a lawyer, and in my kind of former life, I was a lawyer in a large law firm, and I represented companies in sexual misconduct cases. And to do that, I did investigations into that. I retired. And then later in about 2019, I came out of retirement to do an investigation because someone contacted me to tell me that they thought that there were a lot of women who were being sexually assaulted in a Buddhist organization. I did that investigation, and I found out that these organizations, and there were many that followed that, were not willing to hold themselves accountable. And that was a surprise to me. It was a surprise to me that corporate America, not exactly a bastion of morality, was perhaps doing a better job on this than religious and spiritual America. And so I went back into the practice of law at McAllister Oliverius, where I lead a practice group that litigates on behalf of survivors of spiritual and religious abuse. Mostly it is sexual abuse, sometimes it is forced labor. And so that's who I am. Since we're talking today about ways to empower survivors, then I want to introduce you to our other discussion partners. One is Rachel Bernstein, the other is Rachel Montgomery, both of whom are in the kind of roles of empowering survivors in their lives. So, Rachel Montgomery, let me start with you. So, tell us who you are and what you do in this world of survivors.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for asking. My name is Rachel Montgomery, and I am a survivor. And I've been in the, I suppose, survivor world. Well, I identified myself as a survivor coming into the 2020, 2021. And since that time, I've been engaged in litigation, and I've also gone on to support other survivors in a peer support setting.
Excellent. And that's what we're going to talk about. All of the things that we're talking about today are focused on that kind of support that survivors need. And certainly support of other survivors is good. But we also need, and this is a big one for me, Rachel Bernstein, is our clients need therapy also. So I know you have a focus on cult survivors. Tell us about what you're doing.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and also to speak with all of you. I am a therapist and an educator, and I've been doing this work as a licensed marriage and family therapist for about 35 years now. And so I see people privately. I work with former members. I work with people who've been in relationships that they said were cult-like one-on-one cults. And I help guide the families to know how to help their loved ones. And I run now 4 different support groups and have a weekly podcast that I host. And I'm very committed to being able to be a resource and help people find the resources that they need after they come out of these situations.
That is terrific because, as I said, I think that having the support of other survivors who've been through the same thing and who understand, and also having a therapeutic relationship are necessary for me and my group to do what we do in litigation, right? Because litigation is an arduous road, and without that kind of support, it can be very difficult. So, I want to open our conversation by talking about the C word, which is cult. So, in the beginning, I thought, well, I didn't know what a cult was, and I'm not sure I know now, even because the law doesn't really define it. But I have come to see that many of the clients that we have are in groups that we might categorize as a cult. So, Rachel Bernstein, I want to start with you. What do you think a cult is? How do you define it in the work that you do?
Thank you. It's such a good question, especially because cults will define themselves to be able to prove that they're not cults. And if they live communally, they'll say, oh, well, in cults, people don't live communally, or whatever is the opposite of them. So it is something that's ill-defined and redefined to protect cults at times. So it's good to have a sense of what it is and what it isn't. It's also something that's going to dovetail with fundamentalist branches of religion. So you'll see some similarities, but I'll point out the differences. So just to go through this pretty quickly, first, you have an authoritarian leader. You have someone who is at the top. No one is above them. No one is watching them. No one is telling them what to do. So it's a free-for-all. They can be in charge of it in any way. And also, they can change the rules and the laws and have their own kind of brand of morality and legality. Then there's the us versus them mentality. The outside world is evil or dangerous or lower than and less than. And then the total control over everything, not just spiritual issues, but every personal choice, every relationship, finances, even your thoughts. They want to be in control of your thoughts. Then fear and punishment, threats of harm, shunning, spiritual consequences, and exploitation of time, labor, money, sexuality. They have their own brand of way of exploiting people in each individual cult. And now some are protecting themselves legally by having people sign non-disclosure agreements, and then they don't have to have any accountability at the end of the day. And then suppression of individuality. And people who come out of cults will say, I don't know who I am. I don't know who I am anymore. I grew up learning to be just like everyone else, thinking and feeling like everyone else because I was supposed to, or I only know now how to conform and become like others. And then manipulative recruitment. So there's one particular cult group, they call it heavenly deception. They actually have a name for it. And they can say whatever they want to you to get you to come in, and they know they're lying, and the ends justify the means to cultic groups. And then information control, censorship. You can't access information online about the cult. You can't talk to people who have left. You can't get other sources of information or other sources of the truth. And then isolation. They become your number one priority, your number one in your world. So they'll break you off from family, friends, outside perspectives. And then the thing that I think is the linchpin, the thing if someone says, well, what is the one thing that would really distinguish a cult from a religion? I talk about the deception, not just in what we talked about with the manipulation in terms of recruitment, but while people are already in, they never know what the true intention is for them. They never know about the true nature of the leader. They don't know they're being love bombed for loyalty and reciprocity to give back. They don't know there's a misrepresentation of their purpose there, and only gradual disclosures about what the true intention is, if you get them at all. And also that there's this distorted magical thinking and magical outcomes, the wonderful things that are going to happen to you supposedly if you stay, and the horrible things that will happen to you if you leave. And I think that that encapsulates sort of the vision of what I come across day in and day out with my clients.
Yeah, that really resonates with me as well, including the saying, "People don't join a cult,"
Yeah,
right? It's
right.
that you later find out. So, Rachel Montgomery, did you join a cult?
I did not join a cult. Thanks for clarifying. I
But
appreciate
you
the
found
chance
out
to answer
later.
that.
Yeah,
I
you found
did.
out
I did.
later. And
I
and
think mhm.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
I resonate so well with what Rachel
Yeah.
just shared, because what I was thinking was it really is something that starts out as one thing and then turns into something else. That deception, it seems core to me too. That landed for me.
Yeah. And the all of those elements, the totalitarian leadership, you could check off that box, Rachel.
I could check off a lot of those boxes. And it's interesting, the ones I also can't check off. So just know, like, how our cults are the same and yet not the same. But for me, that deception piece Rachel described was quite
Yeah.
central. Yeah.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting point, how they're the same and not the same. What I think about cults, because the law doesn't have any definition. So, for example, cults are not illegal. We don't even being labeled a cult does not make you illegal. Being in a cult is not illegal. Being the leader of a cult is not illegal. And partly that's because the First Amendment of the Constitution gives us so much so-called religious freedom, and even the definition of religion is very broad. But where we can draw the line is between beliefs and behavior. So if we look at some of the scandals that we've had in religion, it doesn't matter what you believe, it matters what your behavior, when your behavior crosses the line into something that is illegal, as it did in your case, Rachel Montgomery. You know, it doesn't matter what people believe, it matters what they're doing from a legal point of view. And so we think that one of the very big elements in this conversation, at least from a litigation standpoint, is the word coercion. Because we have some laws that talk about coercion. So if we're talking about all of those things, Rachel, that you mentioned, I think of them as high demand, high control. I'm gonna I'm gonna demand your complete loyalty. I'm gonna demand you dress a certain way, you think a certain way, and I'm going to control that by determining that you live in isolation, that you cut off connection with your families, and all of those kinds of things. So I think of them as high demand, high control, all of which creates this coercive environment. And that coercion leads to people doing and thinking things in a particular way. So, for example, one of the questions that I am often asked, and probably you are, both of you also, is, but then why don't people leave? You're not prisoners, you're not locked up. Is there a key? You know, I hear this all the time. So, Rachel Montgomery, in your experience, why didn't you leave? Or why did you leave when you did?
Well, I'll say for me, the experience of what Rachel Bernstein was describing of deception, for me, I was really scaffolded into a place where I think it sort of seems very like it's quite eloquent in that as it turns into what it really is, what you didn't know it was when you first got there, you at the same time proportionately are losing your sense of who you are. You're
Mm,
becoming more of what they want you to be. At least for me, my experience was I was becoming less and less, my sense of self was becoming less and less associated with me and more associated with them. And so as that ramped up, so did the behaviors and sort of the characteristics of the place, the ones that maybe are not so visible when you first get there.
mhm.
So when you don't have a sense of yourself outside of, when you relate who you are to that entity, to this group, to those people, that is who you are, is that group in those people. Your sense of who you are outside of that relationship starts to not exist. And so for me, if I was to even have the thought of leaving, it would be like, leave myself, leave me. This is me. This is who I am. What are you talking about? So regardless of what could or would have happened, I couldn't leave something that I thought was who I was.
Yeah, that makes sense. Rachel, do you see that in your clients as well? And how do they deal with that?
Right. So often that's beautifully said. I talk about something similar to what you were talking about, Rachel M. That there are so many times that people will say, I don't know who I am anymore, so I'm not quite sure how to be in the world. And I am not sure that I feel equipped any longer because I'm so detached from myself. It is very handicapping. There are so many reasons that people stay, and I think it's also good to mention that the question itself, as we all know, and I know we've talked about, is problematic because it can sound like it's victim blaming. People who will say they stayed in an abusive relationship are asked why did they stay, as opposed to what dynamics were put in place by your controller and your abuser that made it feel impossible for you to leave. And so I think the why did I stay question can feel like you're putting the responsibility on the person who was harmed rather than the person who trapped them. So I want to just be clear about that as we talk about the reasons that people stay. But I think that not being able to feel like you can trust yourself anymore, that you can make decisions on your own anymore, that there's so much gaslighting to make you feel like you are incapable. You're incapable of thinking, you're incapable of decision making, you're incapable of living a good life and being a good person. You also have low self-worth and you feel that you're not deserving sometimes of freedom, but also there is this carrot that is dangled in front of you that the thing that you went in to get, the promises that you've been made are right around the corner. You're almost there. And that will continue the whole time that you're in. You'll never quite achieve the things that you were promised, but you'll think, I can't leave now. It's like this sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah,
And
exactly what I was thinking, sunk cost fallacy.
yeah, exactly. And it's so addictive. And so it really attaches to us because we don't want all of this devotion and all this time and all this sacrifice to be for naught. I think there's also this freeze and fawn response that people get used to being in that happens way more than fight or flight. And people then get into what we call the trauma responses and they stay. They've also normalized in their mind, we normalize being mistreated at times, being neglected at times. But I also think that when you're with someone who is abusive towards you, or when you're with someone, a partner who's mercurial and difficult to be with, you're not really thinking of an exit plan as much as you're thinking about how to survive the next 5 minutes
Mhm.
and how to survive that next confrontation and how to prove something about yourself to show that you're worthy. And so you might not have the kind of luxury of being able to zoom out and see the big picture and ask yourself the questions. Am I getting all the things that I was promised? Is this worth it? Does this person deserve my devotion?
Yeah, I'm I have been struck by the similarity, and you mentioned it earlier, Rachel B., about the one-on-one domestic violence situation. And it is the case that, of course, we used to ask women, why didn't you leave? Or sometimes it is men that are in an abusive situation.
Hmm.
And we have learned, hopefully, in those areas, that there are many reasons that people do not leave, even when they are involved in sexual misconduct. They
Hmm.
not necessarily want to have the sexual attention or the sexual acts, but they feel that they must. And so, along with why didn't they leave, which I agree with you is a question which puts the burden on the victim or the survivor instead of the person who's abusing their power. There's another question that comes up all the time, which is, but didn't you consent?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? And in our work, we're often bringing cases of sexual assault. And we know that this is going to come up under some of the laws. Now, it's my thinking that coercion, that kind of high demand, high control dynamic that we're talking about, that coercion kind of negates the ability to consent. But let me start with you, Rachel Montgomery, because you had a similar experience in the cult you were in. How do you feel about that issue of consent?
Well, it's really interesting because listening to both of you talk, I was thinking, it never occurred to me to leave my cult. I wasn't thinking of leaving. I was accepting the behaviors and situations I was put in as, like you said, Rachel, be the norms and reality of my new existence, which I thought of as kind of groomed into thinking as a higher existence. I think when I at least found myself in the circumstances where my sense of self was tied to this new reality, that new reality had a new set of rules that are really hard to explain to someone that maybe isn't in that exact world. I mean, I might as well have been like plopped into like a Lord of the Rings movie. I mean, a completely different reality, different landscape, different people, different ways of behaving. And those ways of behaving involve things that outside of that context are really harmful and abusive, and damaging. The layers of myself that existed before I was indoctrinated into this situation were harmed absolutely by those actions. But my new mask, my new, fantasy version of myself, this version of myself that existed there would have described what was happening as beneficial. And the additional sort of, at least I found in my specific dynamic, threats and risks were very transparent. So if you don't do this behavior, you're damned to eternal hell, essentially, is maybe a more colloquial way to describe it. So that you're not just this life, but all future lives are permanently impacted. Things like that felt very real and very tangible in the context of where I was really like a life or death kind of consequence, worse than an ordinary consequence.
Yeah. Rachel, I recall actually, I think that Rachel Montgomery, that I had this conversation with you once about, and if it wasn't you, well, then you can take credit for this if it's at all smart. But a client one time said to me, if I'd been raped at gunpoint or at knife point in a dark alley, I would have known that I was raped.
Mm.
But and to your point, Rachel, I had this other new set of rules in which what was violating my boundaries was considered to be for good. And if I didn't do it, it had as much danger attached to it as being raped in a dark alley. So the implication being that a person who's raped under force or threat is not going to say no,
Mhm.
right? They're going to submit. And we see this as something that we understand, that you're not going to fight back when a person has a gun to your head. On the other hand, I think it's hard for us sometimes to see that the danger psychologically and emotionally is there in these situations and can also prevent people. It's too dangerous to leave. it's too dangerous to not do what the leader says. So, Rachel Bernstein, do your clients also have that kind of sense of having had to do something that they didn't have full ability to consent to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to define what happened to you, having the language, is something we're going to get to when we talk about why it takes so long for
Yes.
people sometimes to report these things. But I think consent is a very interesting issue because a lot of people have been taught through, unfortunately, legal cases that have come before them that, throughout modern history as I know it, that people are told that if they didn't say no, that somehow they were saying yes. And that's not the case. I think also that there really is this need, a requirement, I think, that in order to have consent, you need to have full information. You also need to be able to say no without fear. And as soon as there is this coercion, manipulation, an imbalance of power, it's at the hands of a spiritual leader, or it's at the hands of somebody who is your teacher in some way. You really cannot give free consent anymore. I think it's also important to note that with consent, it needs to be ongoing. So it should be able to be something that's maintained only based on new information that you get along the way. Because if you consent to be in a relationship or to join something, get involved in something, and then it turns on you and becomes dangerous and destructive, you still, and you might not realize it, but you still hold on to the power of withdrawing your consent based on new information. And there are also people who are pushed to say yes to things and to sign on to things without having a chance to think it through and have a lawyer look through it before they sign on. But I do think that there is this sort of false dilemma. Like, you can give your consent to stay, but also if they tell you, like Rachel Montgomery was saying, that you're going to be damned forever if you leave, are you really giving your consent, or are you feeling and being left to feel like you really do not have a choice? And
Yeah.
so I think also people are held to this standard of integrity. You said yes to this, so you need to stick to that. Well, I didn't say yes to this as this has become. I said
Right.
yes to originally based on how it was falsely promised.
But those little small steps make difference, don't they, Rachel B?
Mhm.
We get into these things gradually, I think,
Yes, yes.
which leads to the question when we're talking about gradually is in the legal system that we have very short statutes of limitations for
Mhm.
bringing particularly sexual assault claims, sometimes as short as 2 years. And yet I think that both Rachels would say that it takes much longer than that. So, Rachel Bernstein, tell me what you experience with your clients in terms of how long it takes to understand and really come to grips with what actually happened.
I'm so glad that the legal system is now looking at this because it rarely is something that people have the wherewithal and the clarity to be able to report clearly and accurately soon after it's happened. I've had plenty of clients in here who have talked about not wanting to be touched and having nightmares and a startle response. And I'll say, based on what they were talking about their experiences, is that because of the abuse you incurred? And they'll say, the what? And so it is really important that we define these terms, that we can help people know what abuse is and what it looks like. And if it's happened to them, and it might explain so much about how they're feeling now and the difficulties they're having now. Also, what neglect is, what endangerment is, but
Mhm,
also what love really is. And what
mhm.
safety really is, so that and what your rights are. You have rights. So to define everything so people know the distinctions is really incredible. But I think also people feel like they have shame, their own shame, and they have self-blame for what
Mhm.
happened, or they feel deserving of it, or they're worried about that there's going to be a backlash against them, they're going to lose their community, they're going to lose everything. And also they're worried about re-traumatization, because we see what happens to people who have to face their abuser or go to trial. Sometimes it works out okay, but oftentimes it's a huge mess, and re-traumatization happens. I think also just people feel ashamed that they loved and trusted someone who hurt and deceived them. But there's nothing to feel shame about, because loving and trusting someone is who you are,
Right.
and hurting and deceiving someone is who they are. But
Yes,
you just need to learn who to offer that gift to, and if they're
that's right.
deserving of it.
Yeah, yeah, such a good point, because we need people who trust. Often people say to me, well, that's, I feel terrible about this, but it would not happen to me. That's another common myth.
Oh, yeah.
But the
Hmm.
reality is that it is people who want something better for themselves, for the world, who are trusting. These are people who are positive contributors to society. And so we have to, I think of, when you were talking, Rachel B., I was thinking about the French woman, Dominique
Yes.
Pericaud.
Uh-huh.
Shame must change sides.
Hmm.
It's not our survivors who should be ashamed. It is the people who have done this to them. But Rachel Montgomery, I want to hear from you, because I want to ask you a question I already know the answer to. Did it take you a long time to realize that you had been sexually assaulted?
Well, if I was using the legal definition of a long time, then yes. But I think for me, it feels pretty short. What,
Right.
yeah, what Rachel's describing is really on point. I mean, you're spending, at least from speaking from my personal experience, you're spending years unpeeling the layers of the belief system and refinding reality. And that's a huge undertaking. It takes a lot of data points. Like for me, that was the experience. I had to come back into this reality gradually over time, as I found evidence and burden of proof personally from reading different cult literature and memoirs and testimonies to help me come to grip with the fact that I had been in a situation that wasn't what I thought it was. So that was really the bulk of the time, was unraveling and unpacking that experience, which took, I mean, maybe it sounds like a long time when I say it out loud, but 8 years
Yeah.
to even
Yeah.
unravel that
Right.
aspect of what
Right.
happened.
So it leads me to think about the things that we need to solve in the legal system, one of which is not having a kind of universal definition of consent. Rachel Bernstein, you alluded to that. Rachel Montgomery, to the fact that in your case, we were able to use the Human Trafficking Act because it's based on coercion, and it is a 10-year statute of limitations. So you can see the difference between 2 years and 10 years is a survivor being able to actually make a claim. So I want to stop now, and I want to invite anyone in the audience to put questions in the Q&A that you should be found at the bottom of your screen. And so I'm going to go there and look at the questions, if I can actually manage to do that. Hold on. All right, so here's a question. In the coercive Buddhist group I was in, we were told that we would be breaking every Buddhist vow if we left. That sounds very familiar to me. I'm sure it sounds familiar to you, Rachel. Rachel M., and probably Rachel B. as well. In other words, it wasn't just unsafe, it was managed as unethical to leave, which I presume the writer of this question was another, kind of burden to put on people. Many I know stay so that they can, quote, keep their vows and be a person of integrity. They then blame certain, um, maybe people, and not the organization. How can we support people to unravel this depth of complication? So I will open it up. Well, the writer is going to rewrite and put a little bit more in there. But while they are doing that, Rachel Montgomery, I think probably you had similar kinds of feelings that if you left, you would be breaking your vows. So how can we support people with this issue?
Right. It's framed as the good people stay, the strong people stay, the
Yes.
ethical people stay. And that's very challenging. I have a
In-
lot of awe for people that worked to unravel that and extract themselves from these
Mhm.
circumstances. Something that's hard for me to speak to because I experienced excommunication and the group extracted me on my behalf. It's a bit of a different dynamic.
Yes, but and you work with a survivor, supporting survivor group. Do people in the group, are they working on unraveling this?
They are working on unraveling this. I think I'm still working on unraveling this too. And
Mhm.
it's a big theme in thinking about how you view yourself when you leave and how you view the people that stayed.
Yeah. Rachel Bernstein, how do we support people unraveling this depth of complication? This leaving is unethical. Leaving is breaking your vows.
Right. So, what's so interesting about this is that at its very core, it's a lie
Mm,
because this goes against Buddhist teachings. Buddhist
mm,
teachings are about kind of personal discernment and free will and freedom to walk your own path, understanding your own path. So when someone says it is unethical for you to leave, basically what I hear is they're hoping you're not going to find out what the truth is because you're actually not allowed to access information from other teachers or from the internet. You have to only get your information there so that they can convince you that it's unethical to leave. And I also hear it psychologically. I hear that leader saying, I won't be able to tolerate you leaving. My ego will not be able to tolerate you leaving. And so I'm going to make you feel there's something wrong with you and that you're doing something wrong because then I can use guilt and manipulation
mhm,
get you to stay and to get you to feel like you're doing something against your own integrity because you signed up for something, but you didn't sign up for this. And
mhm,
usually these groups that are abusive in nature, not always, but usually they are their own form, their own branch of Buddhism, their own branch of other religions. And so they don't follow the same rules. And so it's important when you're told that you're going to be doing something wrong by leaving, but you can tell that this is actually something that is not what you signed up for, and it doesn't actually feel potentially right, that that is a falsehood, and that's the leader saying, I don't want you to go.
yeah, I can't stand it if you go. It's a threat to ego. And of course, the abuse of power and the ego are very much intertwined, I would imagine, Rachel, psychologically, in these leaders. So, yeah, that makes sense. I have another question here. What are the statutes on rape by fraud versus rape by force? How do you argue sexual abuse compared to sexual assault under the law? So it's a very interesting question. Thank you for this because it gives me an opportunity to say that there are kind of two pathways to litigation. To perhaps to justice and accountability. One is the civil and the other is the criminal. So both of them have statutes, and the criminal justice system, I feel at least, has largely failed people who are raped. We bring very few criminal cases of rape. I don't deal with the criminal side at all. The side of the law that I work with is the civil justice system, and so the every state has a different definition of rape. And then, in addition, as I mentioned, we've also used the Human Trafficking Act. So it's a little bit hard to say, kind of what the actual definition is. But basically, sexual assault is an umbrella term that includes rape. It includes, which is by force is a criminal concept. So in the civil concept, it is rape which is where you did not consent. That's why consent becomes so important in these cases. But Rachel Montgomery, your thoughts on this?
It's a very good question. And not knowing the law, obviously, as well as you too, Carol, but having experience being
Mm-hmm.
engaged in the law, I think the language that I experienced from the civil side versus the criminal side helps me sort of parse apart how to talk about what the difference would be in terms of what people are looking for when they're talking to you as a victim survivor. In the
Mm-hmm.
criminal side, they really want to know and understand that concept of how were you forced, the circumstances. They really want more black and white concepts. In the civil environment, I felt there was much more openness and wiggle room to discuss the experience as a whole and its complexities, because the civil system existed to prove that I had experienced harm. And that really opened it beyond just exactly what was the, from 9 a.m. to, 11 p.m., what was your day? What did, like, very concrete, very step-by-step,
Mm-hmm.
very time-oriented. In the civil environment was much more open to hearing the context and the depth of the experience.
It points to an interesting difference between the two pathways. In the criminal justice system, there's a prosecutor, and the prosecutor is really working on behalf of the state, the government. It is for all citizens, not for the citizen or the person who has been raped who is before them. It's for society at large. Whereas the civil justice system, people actually have their own lawyer. So that's, I think, because there is a question in here I just saw about litigation in general, how it can empower people. And I think the answer to that is you have your own, for lack of a better word, posse,
Mhm.
your own team of supporters who are telling your story and maybe giving your voice back. And so, Rachel Bernstein, in your experience, is that empowering to survivors? Can it be empowering, that kind of recovering the voice that has been suppressed?
It is so important, actually, the work that you do, Carol, that you are a superhero. You are someone who, when the legal system, when there is a system in place to protect you, and you had no idea there was, you thought you were on your own,
Mm,
and you thought that you would be the lone voice, and you thought that there was no one there to be able to help back you up, then, why would you come forward? Why would you want to put yourself through that in such an isolated way? It feels very dangerous, feels very scary. So when you come in, dun, da, da, and say, okay, I think I can help here. And I can also speak for you to a certain degree. I can help you see that's what happened to you is wrong, and not only wrong, but illegal. Then
yeah.
it really is important that you feel that there is, again, this system that cares about you and is
Mm,
going to do what it can to fight for you. And you're not all alone. You're not by yourself. It also helps other people come forward when they see
yeah.
that there was, right? Sometimes people don't want to be the lone voice, but they sometimes don't want to be the first voice. They,
Yes.
right. So after somebody comes forward, then they'll say, oh, I see how that went. Maybe it was rough at certain times, but there was an outcome that's going to help me feel like I have a place in this world again, that my experience matters and my words matter. And the fact that something was done to me that was wrong matters, gives me the strength and the courage to come forward.
Yeah. So that's fabulous. Thank you for that. That leads me to another thought, which is that the result of the civil justice system is money. So that's an important thing to think about. The criminal justice system, somebody goes to jail. If you're lucky, if you convince 12 people that you were raped by force or whatever the statute of that particular state requires you to prove. And so one of the questions that's in the Q&A box is, for what kind of thing might a guru go to jail? And jail is the end destination of the criminal justice system. It requires that you prove to 12 people whatever the elements of the crime are. In the civil justice system, nobody goes to jail. Now, sometimes survivors want their perpetrator, the person who harmed them, to go to jail. Sometimes I find that survivors want the organization that shunned them, that refused to listen to them when they made reports of wrongdoing, they want them to be held accountable as well as the perpetrator, because sometimes being assaulted is, well, being ignored when assaulted is as painful as the assault. And so I want to ask you about money. So a lot of people within these organizations say this isn't true, and this is a person who is only after money. My perspective is, if you got into an automobile accident, I happen to be in Manhattan and they drive crazy here. And so if you're in an automobile accident and you harm someone because you hit them in the crosswalk, you are going to pay money to rehabilitate that person and compensate them for their harm. I don't see any difference between that and being sexually assaulted by a leader. And so I encourage people to think about the money differently, but I'm interested in your perspectives on that.
Right. So I'll jump in first, and then Rachel Montgomery, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about this. What I find is that people will find any kind of excuse,
Yes.
right, to defame. So if it were not about money, it'd be something, she's just doing it for this, or he's just doing it for that.
Mhm.
And so again, it's like putting the onus on the victim, the person who was harmed in this way, to have to justify how
Mhm.
and why they're doing this. And so I think it's just wrong that it's happening at all. But there are a
Yes.
lot of people that need resources. They have been left with nothing. They have given over everything to this person who harmed them. They have sold everything, or just have to start again. They missed out on starting a career or starting a family or going to school. They also might have a lot of psychological and or psychiatric needs because of their experiences there.
Mm.
And they also might have physical kind of impacts from their time there. There are a lot of people who were harmed physically, and a lot
Yeah.
of people who were also neglected and kept from seeing a dentist, kept from seeing a doctor. They have a lot to make up for to be able to keep their bodies healthy, or to get their body back into a healthy enough state so they can live safely. All of this takes resources. All of this takes money. And so I think that they should be able to get what they
Mhm.
want to be able to get. And goodness knows, a lot of these gurus have plenty, and
Yeah.
they will not be suffering by
Yeah.
giving you a little bit.
Absolutely. Rachel Montgomery?
I sure hope they suffer even giving you just a little bit.
I love it.
There is a certain, perhaps psychological value in revenge and at least accountability, like it should hurt a little bit.
Yeah, I think, when you don't have the avenue of the criminal system, which I'm one of those people that would have
Yep.
loved to have a criminal outcome, and that's not something as available to all of us. A civil outcome seems like a really good replacement for that sense of accountability, or that sense of trying to do something to sort of right the wrong. For me, I know that the community I was a part of, the cult I was a part of, money has value to them.
Yeah.
But the guru, it helps them live a more comfortable lifestyle in the circumstances in the community I came from. It also helps them grow their power and influence in the world. It helps them to open more centers. It helps them to buy more supplies. It helps them to write more books. It helps them just to grow their presence and grow their recruitment. And so for me, the possibility of being able to make that process harder for them
Yeah.
was really exciting. And then to realize that there is a punitive element to taking someone's resources from them, and that they may feel less inclined to be, I mean, one would hope, although seemingly unlikely, to be less criminal in their behavior, because there are actual consequences that they can see and experience.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting point, Rachel, because the law tells us that when we are suing an organization, they are only negligent. And that's the crime. This is the statute that we use, the claim that we use. You are only negligent if you knew about it in advance. There is now no question about the fact that in your case, Rachel Montgomery, they know about it. And anything that happens from here on forward is a tremendous legal risk. So you would not only hope, you would think that a rational mind would think that you cannot have the same kind of situations occurring that happened to you, for example. Another question about labor exploitation. So let me read that one. Let me see here. And this has to do with, let's see, the legal framework around labor exploitation when we have volunteered to be within a group and there has been no contract or definition of what was expected of us in the beginning. So here's the kind of labor law that we have used, which is under the Trafficking Act. So it basically requires force or threat of force or a scheme or a plan to use the labor. So for example, if I am in an organization and I am providing commercial some kind of commercial product. Let's say I have a manufacturing facility, I'm making widgets, and I also have this cult, which I call the, I always love to make up names, the spiritual light of the holy, forgiveness, or the, it reminds me of Garrison Keillor and the, a perpetual responsibility, Our Lady of Perpetual Responsibility. There are names. So let's just say I have a cult by that name. I have a manufacturing facility, but the people who are in my cult have to work in the manufacturing facility. If they do not work in the manufacturing facility, there are threats against them. Now, they do not have to be physical threats. They can be threats that you would find, that a reasonable person would find to be coercive. So if you're being coerced into labor, that's different than volunteering to labor. And I think that that's fundamentally what the difference is between a group where your church runs a soup kitchen for the homeless, and you volunteer every Wednesday. If you are free to go, if you are free to quit, if you are free to decide not to work with them, then you are probably not being forced into labor. So I think that's the difference there. So here's a comment or a question. Model Penal Code's global consent provision states assent does not constitute consent if there's force, duress, or deception. So I think this is, so there's a couple of Oregon statutes that this person has given for us, very helpful. Fraudulent representation prohibiting rape by fraud among doctors making medical. What about spiritual or financial misrepresentation from gurus? Can you explain the legalities on deception and misrepresentation? Such a fabulous question. Thank you to the person who put this in, giving us the kind of model global consent that is where we're wanting to go, right? It's where we're wanting to go, where it's assent does not constitute consent if there's force, duress, or deception. Spiritual misrepresentations runs us afoul, unfortunately, of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is very broad and very, I would say, generous. But there is, as I mentioned before, there is a line in the sand between belief and behavior. So fraud is difficult to prove under the First Amendment because courts do not want to entangle themselves into a situation where they're trying to determine. For example, we had some examples earlier of a guru saying, or a person saying that they were told in their community that if you leave, you are bad, or that you have to do this in order to achieve enlightenment. Let's take that as an example. Fraud would mean that the person does not achieve enlightenment, but the court is not going to entangle itself into determining whether there is enlightenment, whether Jesus walked on water. They're simply staying away from those kinds of things. So fraud is very a difficult thing to prove under the First Amendment in the United States. However, many of the laws that have fraud also have coercion, and coercion is something, as you can see, is outside of belief. It's outside, it's in the realm of behavior. So we are often using coercion under the law against cults and spiritual religious groups instead of fraud. I think we've almost come to our time. I regret if we did not get your question answered, but I think that Emily or Jessica, who are our moderators here behind the scenes, will put our email addresses in the chat box so that you can reach out to any of us. And if I did not answer your question, there was a question that I'll answer really quickly while you're doing that, which is about children. Children cannot consent to sexual conduct under certain ages, depending by state. And in addition, it's not quite as clear cut under forced labor, but it certainly is the case that children are considered to be in their more vulnerable condition to those kinds of things. So I'll try to answer that question right there. So thank you so much to Rachel Bernstein, Rachel Montgomery, to all of you who have attended today. I hope it has helped to give you a perspective on empowering survivors in these extraordinary organizations that are based on coercive activities. Thank you for joining us. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.